As both Soulsborne games and the games inspired by them, the Soulslikes, continue to gain popularity in the video game space, a new sort of problem is emerging for the burgeoning genre. These games, at their core, are meant to be fresh, different, and challenging action RPG experiences. And it's the challenge that's creating a bit of a pickle for the newer games in said genre. How do you continue to provide a sense of both uniqueness and challenge to a player base that's getting increasingly familiar with and used to this particular brand of game design? It's a problem that every Souls game developer is struggling with, from the greats over at From Software to the newcomers entering into the genre with their particular takes on this idea. The difficulty and the challenge is actually getting harder and harder to get just right. We all know that sense of accomplishment, the thrill of conquering a difficult boss or challenge in a Souls game. When it's done right, a game like this will feel challenging, but will ultimately also feel fair and doable with a bit of effort, practice, and learning of the mechanics. But what happens when players, having played a ton of these games, are starting to get good, as it were, and are starting to easily surmount these games, and are losing both the challenge and that sense of accomplishment in the process? And it's in this kind of situation that a new challenger has entered the arena of Soulslikes, from a Chinese studio at that, in the First Berserker Khazan. And from the outset, as soon as the game's first demo came out, players gravitated towards two things: the excellent combat that felt even more fast-paced and hack-and-slash-like than anything else before, and the difficulty. And as the game has since come out and gotten into the hands of players, myself included, it's the difficulty that's been on the forefront of the discussion and the discourse surrounding the game. And yeah, I get it. Every time a new Souls-like comes out, there's the inevitable discussion on its difficulty. It's too hard, it's punishing, you just aren't good enough. Those are some of the common talking points from both sides. And generally, regardless of where I fall in terms of the discussion, I'll always be able to explain why a game seems to be more difficult than it actually is. It's a build issue, there's this one mechanic that isn't being explained properly, there's generally something that is in the game that some people are gravitating more towards than others, and that's the reason for the discrepancy in terms of difficulty. But this time is very, very different. After playing and finishing it, I can confidently say that, when it comes to the First Berserker Khazan, more so than any other Souls-like that I've played, and I've played all the big ones: Nioh, Wo Long, Lies of P, Thymesia, Mortal Shell, etc., etc. It feels like it's taken the idea of challenge from a From Software game and really gone to town on it. I mean, I played the game on normal, without using summons, and basically did everything to the point where I got both the true ending and the platinum for the game. And I found the game to be quite challenging. And I get it, difficulty is a variable thing. But regardless of that spectrum of perceived difficulty, in many ways, I do believe that the game is actually designed to feel really hard, punishingly so, and to feel that way for the majority of its runtime. The core systems and gameplay decisions made from the development team all point to a game that's really meant to push the player, to challenge them, and for those that ultimately decide to confront that challenge and those trials, well, there is a lot of fun and satisfaction to be had at the end of it all. So, today, that's what I want to focus in on: the difficulty of the First Berserker Khazan. I want to dive in and really explore what all the game's systems, its design, its story, its characters, everything about the game really, how it focuses on creating that punishingly difficult experience, and how it does it in a way that feels very divergent from any other Soulsborne or Souls-like game that we've seen today. A word of caution before we dive into it all. This video will contain spoilers for the First Berserker Khazan. While I won't be focusing too heavily on the story, I will touch on the bosses, locations, and gameplay systems, including some late game stuff. So, As usual, if you haven't played and finished the game and care about those spoilers, then well, viewer discretion is advised here. When looking at the First Berserker Khazan as a Soulslike, the thing that it will remind you of the most is most definitely Team Ninja's Soulslike series in Nioh. In much the same way that Lies of P pulled directly from Bloodborne and a good chunk of Sekiro, the First Berserker Khazan definitely pulls from the Nioh series and then kind of melds that with some of its own unique ideas and concepts, and of course, takes that inspiration from Sekiro as well. I'm not sure if the term Nioh-like actually exists, but for fans of that series, there is definitely some of that DNA present here. There's of course the hack and slash style combat, but then there's other things, like the mission-based game structure, the Kodama-like collectible jarlings, the equipment rarity system, equipment set bonuses, and even some of the combat systems have their foundations in what Nioh established. What is of course different is the story, the world building, and the presentation style. It's worth praising, particularly after Shadow of the Erdtree disappointed with its performance, that the First Berserker Khazan is a really well-made video game. Now, it is worth noting that the presentation and the story are things that I think are a bit more basic and kind of recede more into the background. The art style is, of course, very anime-esque, and the story is a simple tale of revenge and betrayal, set in a sort of traditional fantasy world with emperors, empires, dragons, magic, and whatnot. I assume a lot of this is actually lifted from the parent property of the DNF mobile game, but I myself wasn't overly familiar with the franchise and was able to kind of follow the story anyway. That is to say, that this is a game that isn't really being ambitious in terms of its story, its presentation, or its world building or anything like that. What isn't simple, and what the First Berserker Khazan really focuses on, is its combat. Combat that is the most engaging, deep, and versatile that I've ever experienced in a Souls-like game. The combat actually has a sense of speed and a set of mechanics and abilities that kind of push it into the hack and slash action genre just as much as the Souls-like genre. Okay, so an even more action-heavy focused Nioh-like game, with abilities that seem like they tilt the balance more towards that hack and slash side of things than any other game before. How is that bang your head on the wall hard? Well, the difficulty in the game definitely comes from two things. One, the extreme amount of depth that the game's combat and gameplay systems actually have, and then two, the way that the difficulty curve of the game itself actually ramps up. See, deep combat systems and the need to master them is nothing new in any Souls-like game. It's kinda what you do as a fan of the genre. These games will generally have you start off fairly simple. You'll utilize some basic mechanics here and there, and get through the early parts of the game. And then, over time, said game will provide skill checks and progression walls that will force you to get better and engage more deeply with the game's combat systems and mechanics. But the First Berserker Khazan doesn't really ramp you up in that sort of traditional way. It really does throw you right into the deep end, and then kind of just keeps you there. A great example of this is in how the early levels and the basic enemies that you face feel and are. Simply put, while normal enemies in the game are definitely your standard cannon fodder in terms of health, even those enemies have quite a few different attacks at their disposal. Enemies will hit fast and will often have multiple different attack strings, which can each have their own set of timings for guarding, dodging, parrying, and counter-striking. Oh yeah, you heard that right. The First Berserker Khazan features not one, not two, not three, but 4 different defensive mechanics for you to dive into and use, with only one of them being truly optional. There's of course the concept of a brink guard and a brink dodge, which are basically your perfect dodge and perfect block. Brink dodging requires that you dodge at the very last second as an attack is about to hit, and rewards you with a bit less stamina used and a potential follow-up attack depending on your weapon. Brink guarding, on the other hand, is basically the perfect block or parry that originated in Sekiro, and while that Sekiro inspiration is there, I think it's Lies of P's perfect block system that's lifted wholesale here. The system that has you line up the last few animation frames of your guard animation with the last few animation frames of the enemy's attack. I dove in deep on how parrying perfect blocking works in Lies of P, so if you had trouble or didn't quite get how it all works, then I recommend you check out that particular section of my Lies of P video, which I've linked in the description below. But yeah, familiarity with Lies of P and how the parrying system works in that game versus say Sekiro will of course make learning brink guarding in this game a lot easier. Now, already, with just 2 of the 4 defensive mechanics, there's a wealth of complexity there for newcomers. The game, therefore, kinda assumes that you've been around the block and have played your fair share of Souls games and Souls-likes. But then, if that weren't enough, some enemies will also have an unblockable red attack that will flash an icon on screen with you having to press a specific counterattack move to both parry and stagger the enemy. Think the Makiri counter from Sekiro, except unlike Sekiro, where the Makiri counter was more of a standard timing button press immediately following that symbol appearing on screen, the counterattack in Khazan has to actually be timed to land just as the unblockable move is about to hit you. So, there's the potential for timing misses and delays from enemies. And if that wasn't already a lot, there's actually a 4th, seemingly optional defensive mechanic known as Reflection, which sort of acts as a parry move, which literally interrupts an enemy's attack mid-swing. As such, the timing for this particular move is actually different from the brink guard. Here, the idea is very similar to one of Nioh 2's 3 burst counter systems. The one where you actually attack an enemy as they're attacking to interrupt them is, I think, what matches Reflection the best here. Now, we'll cover this more later, but suffice to say, this hidden 4th mechanic does exist, and people are free to dive into the skill trees and use it if they so desire. Now, as with any of these sorts of mechanics in these sorts of games, while it may seem like they're advanced mechanics that provide a good deal of risk and reward, it's actually fairly necessary to learn and use all of them if you actually want to succeed in the First Berserker Khazan. See, what's interesting about the combat encounters in the game, particularly when it comes to the bosses and the mini-boss elite enemies, is that the overall flow of these encounters is quite a bit different from any other Souls or Souls-like game. For Souls and Souls-like players, there's this whole concept of the dance. The idea is this: both the player and the enemy have the same set of general standard tools and capabilities. Both will take turns, attacking and defending, and ultimately, what sort of forms is a dance, where the player will match their attacks and their defense to the boss, finding the particular openings and endings of their attack strings and managing their stamina and trying to get their own attacks in when the opportunity arises. In the First Berserker Khazan, well, the combat encounters with the game's tougher enemies feel less like a dance and more like an actual tug of war. See, what makes the game so tough is most certainly the boss encounters, which are indeed the meat and potatoes of the whole game. And it's in the bosses that the game's real sense of depth, complexity, and sheer amount of stuff can really start to feel overwhelming. Bosses have the standard stuff that's made games like Lies of P and even Shadow of the Erdtree pretty hard for a lot of people. There are roll catches, erratic timings, and delays between strings of attacks that make it really hard to both brink guard and brink dodge said attacks. But the First Berserker Khazan takes things a step farther, much farther, by never really giving you too many openings or moments to breathe. Bosses are relentless and will continue attacking you without fail unless you find the small openings and use them, or use one of the 4 defensive tools to make yourself an opening. The latter concept becomes more important the further into the game you are. Thus, depending on your weapon and your mastery of the game's defensive mechanics, your ability to attack can either be fairly small or completely non-existent. And where ideas like Brink Guard and Brink Dodge would be more akin to optional higher level mechanics in other games, in Khazan, they're often necessary, as even something as early as the 3rd boss of the game, Viper, can quickly exhaust your stamina if you attempt to simply dodge or just guard all of his attacks. No, the only way to both survive and keep your stamina high enough to not only attack, but deplete their stamina gauge and potentially stagger said boss for a brutal attack is to combine both Brink cards with your general attacks and make as few errors as possible. And just like in Lies of P, when you do end up exhausting a boss's stamina bar by attacking and Brink guarding them, well, that just opens them up for a brutal attack that will do a decent chunk of damage but won't necessarily end the encounter like, say, in Sekiro. Now, what's different in Khazan from even Lies of P is that where Lies of P's brutal attacks would just give you a nice chunk of damage, in the First Berserker Khazan, that moment, that window where an enemy is both staggerable and can be hit with a brutal attack, is actually also a window that you can and should use to attack them with a bunch of your strongest combos and moves, before you end it all with that brutal attack as a finisher. Hence, the difficulty for damage and earning it goes up an entire notch here, where the brutal attack from Sekiro has now morphed from the entire end goal of a fight to an actual attack window that's just a part of the overall flow of combat. And this is what I mean when I say that the First Berserker Khazan is designed to feel hard, to push you harder and farther than any other Soulslike. The game most certainly makes you work a lot harder for the damage that you do and the ultimate win that you get, and it rarely, if ever, gives you even a sense of relief or control in these intense boss battles. And all of this is combined with the fact that bosses will have multiple sets of attacks, will have unblockable attacks that need to be counterstruck, and will also dish out nasty status effects that can only be avoided by dodging, as even Brink guarding will still have you accumulate status effect buildup. But wait, it gets even worse, as bosses and enemies in the First Berserker Khazan are actually of 2 types. There's the human enemies and there's the monster enemies. And it's actually the human enemies that are the truly scary ones here. Unlike the monster enemies in the game, who have a fixed purple colored stamina bar that you can slowly whittle down and ultimately get that brutal attack window on, human enemies have regenerating stamina bars, much like Khazan himself. Except the stamina bar for the enemies regenerates a lot faster and a lot more often. And that combined with the super huge health pools, well, you start to see why people find this game so darn hard and so punishing. The bosses do a ton of damage and have tons of health, so the margin for error is low, and the amount of time that you have to play consistently well is rather high. And what's fascinating about the First Berserker Khazan is that while the game does give you a ton of different tools for 3 different types of weapons, it's actually not that great about teaching you how to use it all. Beyond the game giving you a small introduction to brink guarding, dodging, and counter-striking in the first 2 missions of the game, the rest is more or less up to you to find and unlock for yourself. After the second mission, where you're introduced to the game's 3 weapon types in the greatsword, the dual wield, and the spear, you're more or less expected to experiment with one of these and develop your own playstyle. What this means in practice is that you have to go into your particular weapon skill tree and the common skill tree and start making some decisions based on your weapon and how you want to play, you'll want to start developing a sort of build, based on whatever skills you choose and whatever upgrades you get. And you do want to choose wisely, as getting the right skills is the difference between success and utter failure. Take reflecting for instance, which is a vital skill against those human enemies we mentioned earlier. You know, the ones with the super fast regenerating stamina bars that will relentlessly attack you. Well, reflection will melt their stamina bars, if you're able to land it of course, and it will make those battles a lot easier and frequently will interrupt the flurry of attacks and give you a chance to dish out your own damage. Yet, reflection is a skill inside the common skill tree that the game never really emphasizes at all. So, for a lot of players, including myself, you likely will miss out on reflection and won't use it until the very last few bosses of the game, where the skill becomes almost necessary to come out on top. To that end, the game actually does allow you to swap out and reset your selected skills from any skill tree at will, and that is actually also fairly necessary because you will want to swap out skills and adjust your build depending on what you're facing. Some skills and build loadouts will work really great for human enemies, others will do great against monster enemies, and it really kind of depends on how the boss's attack patterns work and what their range is and all that stuff. But not only that, a big reason for that need to shift things around, beyond all the capabilities that we've covered about the bosses, is that there are far too many of them that feel like huge progression walls and skill checks in the game. After every few boss fights, the game will introduce a new gimmick that requires you to either adjust your build or drastically improve your overall skill in the game. Viper, the third boss as we mentioned earlier, is the first major boss that feels like a real progression wall, in that he's a boss that requires you to master brink guarding and brink dodging, and generally also master attack strings and combos. He's also the first boss that ends up getting 2 full life bars, which is something that Souls games generally reserve for a few special bosses near the end. But Viper? He's actually the third boss of the game, and he's the first instance where the game actually requires you to face 2 entirely different enemies with different attack strings, unblockable moves, and mechanics back to back. Yes, it's the same character, but essentially with the 2 life bars, it's 2 different enemies in one. And from there, well, Viper is just a taste of what the game has in store for you for the rest of your playthrough. Immediately following Viper, in the very next mission, is the boss known as Volbaino, which is a hulking monster that throws out these nasty status effects, pushing you to not only learn his brink guard, his counterattack, and dodge timings, but also manage that fire status effect buildup that he dishes out. Volbaino even has a nasty attack that basically sets an entire level of the boss arena on fire, requiring you to run up or down to a secondary level of the same arena or die from status effect buildup. Oh, and the margin of error for making mistakes in just these 2 early bosses is pretty darn slim, as due to the underpowered nature of Khazan at this point, missing even a brink guard or 2, or say a counterattack window, can result in instant death. After this, things do chill out for a mission or 2, but then you're thrust headfirst into Rangkus, a boss that really puts the R in regenerating stamina bars. He's the boss that you're likely supposed to learn and use the reflect system on, as the windows between his attacks are small, and his attacks themselves so relentless that simply brink guarding, dodging, and counter-striking him will make the fight become a long, drawn-out test of endurance, which is what it was for me. And the whole test of endurance thing is another aspect of what makes the First Berserker Khazan feel like such a punishingly hard game. See, in games like Sekiro, and even Lies of P, while the boss battles are tough, there are a few ways to end them after a couple of successful interactions. With Sekiro, It's all about getting that stamina and posture meter of the enemy down to 0. Do that twice, or for the tougher bosses, thrice, and you've basically won. With Lies of P, there's things like the grinder system, which allows you to proc status effects that eat away at enemy life bars, shortening the overall battle significantly. With the First Berserker Khazan, well, there's really no such thing. Take Maluca for example, one of the other big progression walls in the game. After a pretty simple first phase, about halfway through his life bar, the guy transforms, and then suddenly has multiple moves that can basically insta-kill you if you don't perfectly brink guard them and create your own openings. Maluca is particularly challenging because the dude has a super huge health pool, will relentlessly attack you, has regenerating stamina, can heal himself, and in his second phase has a bunch of attacks that will inflict the chaos status effect, which will basically decrease your overall max health. Getting hit by those chaos attacks can not only be deadly, decrease your health pool, but often getting hit by one of the opening attacks of his combos can basically put you in a place to get quickly killed by the follow-up attacks in his attack string. Oh, and if you try to do what some people did with Rangkus and go on the offensive, well, that isn't an option here, because Maluca can actually brink guard your attacks and basically melt your stamina bar when he has one of his 2 weapons out, the katana. It's a rough boss battle, one that requires you to memorize 2 different sets of attack patterns, and in the second phase, requires you to basically play perfectly. In fact, even with a fast weapon like the spear, which is all about flowing attacks and combo chains, frequently, bosses will either be able to not get staggered by said moves, or will be able to avoid getting hit by the brunt of the combo itself. The best way I can explain how all of this works is to use a fighting game analogy and look at a particular boss. Let's use Bellerian. Bellerian is one of the many caster-type human bosses that you'll be facing in the latter half of the game. Bellerian is very much like a zoning character in a fighting game. Think someone like Ryu or say Dhalsim from Street Fighter for instance. Someone who throws attacks and fireballs from afar and tries to keep you from getting in close. Bellerian is very much that sort of character and that boss, in that all her attacks are magic attacks that she shoots out and attacks you with from afar. So, your goal in the whole battle is really to get in close and then dish out as much damage as possible. It's your typical zoner versus close combat character that you see in any fighting game. Where things start to break down though, is in how Bellerian is able to constantly reset the state of the battle in her favor. So, the problem with Bellerian and other caster type bosses like her is that after you put in the effort to sidestep and dodge all their attacks, whether it's brink guards or dodges or whatnot, and when you finally get in close, they will frequently, after 1 or 2 hits, get invincibility frames and simply fly out of range. This whole concept of barely being able to get more than a few attacks in before now having to dodge a flurry of attacks and get in close again is where the First Berserker Khazan really starts to earn its name of being not only the most brutally punishing Souls game, but a bit frustrating as well. But wait, Bellerian is also the first of many bosses that introduces an entirely new gimmick, which is that they can unleash or put on a particular buff that you must interrupt or the battle becomes much harder. One thing that Bellerian will do early on is cast a shield bubble over herself, which basically prevents you from being able to stagger her with your attacks, and allows her to basically tank through your combos and fire off one of her many projectile attacks. It's only after you either break the shield or interrupt her from ever placing it on herself in the first place that you're able to properly attack when you do get in close. And to add insult to injury, in her second phase, she'll begin summoning these skulls on top of herself, while she throws out some kind of projectile that you have to dodge. As she quickly starts summoning these skulls, your number one priority is to interrupt her as quickly as possible, because if she gets her skull number to above 5, then she gets to summon a nasty mini-boss that you actually have to defeat before you can attack her again. The ideal way, and the only way that I was able to beat her, therefore, was to prevent her from ever going past 3 skulls, where she summons lesser enemies that are a bit easier to deal with. So, now, on top of everything else, bosses now have these sort of win states where they can set certain conditions that will insanely power them up. And that's a thing that all bosses following Bellerian are able to do. Take the next boss, Skalpel, for instance. Getting hit by his sword attacks during his boss encounter will cause his sword to glow, and after enough attacks, will allow him to go into a frenzy state. The frenzy state will come after he jumps on top of his coffin, which is on his back, and then he will transform while he attacks you. If he gets through his transformation, all of his attacks come with more speed, plague ailment buildup, and damage, and he's basically unstaggerable at all in this state, which means combos or any kind of long-form attacks are a no-go. So, your first order of business in this battle is to just not get hit. Which, yeah, of course, you don't want to get hit. But, provided you do, then you absolutely must ensure that you knock him off his coffin whenever he climbs on top of it and attempts his transformation. So yeah, with all these things, the First Berserker Khazan just continues to pile on the pressure. As you progress throughout the game, bosses will gain more movesets, will have these win conditions, will often reset back to neutral and then press their advantage, and will have large health pools, and then there's one final thing. Oh yeah, multiple bosses in this game have multiple health bars. People hated this in Lies of P, and I can only imagine how frustrating it will be for them here if those same people decide to pick up the First Berserker Khazan. And on that note, to make matters even more insane, if you end up going for the true ending in the game, then the final boss in Ozma will have not 1, not 2, but 3 separate life bars that you have to take on back to back. Ozma, in particular, is easily the hardest boss I've ever had the misfortune of facing in a Souls game, with the only really comparable thing being Consort Radahn pre-patch in Shadow of the Erdtree. Ozma is basically 3 back-to-back boss battles in one, which you basically have to get through, and it takes time. Ozma's first phase is completely separate from his second one, where he transforms into a winged monster, and then the third phase adds an additional gimmick of you only being able to defeat him after you counterstrike him and then brutal attack him. It's insane, and it took me, learning to properly use the reflection mechanic, playing probably the best I had played all game, nailing every single counter-strike window, and then also using a few additional health consumables beyond the standard 8 heals that you can get in the game. Ozma is the only boss where I've ever had to do that, where I've not only had to level up my playstyle and properly learn a new mechanic, but also use consumables, which I almost never use in any Souls-like that I've played. So yeah, the hardest final boss now goes to Ozma, who's dethroned monsters like the puppet in Lies of P and Sword Saint Ishin in Sekiro. Now, while most of the difficulty in the First Berserker Khazan comes from the bosses, the levels have something pretty interesting as well. There are these elite enemies that are littered throughout the various missions in the game, which both serve as mini progression walls for the level, but then the game also has a sort of challenge system in it, where you need to defeat said elite enemies in a particular way. Sometimes it's not getting hit by them at all, or not using healing items. Sometimes it's having to brink guard them or counterstrike them a set number of times. But whatever the condition is, fulfilling these challenges nets you special rewards, which are usually either some awesome equipment or armor, or crafting recipes that can be essential in your rather difficult journey throughout the game's main campaign. This, combined with the collectible gathering of both the Nioh-style kodamas in the game's Jarlings and finding and destroying soul stones, can have you replay a mission at least twice in order to make sure you get everything you need. There's some neat rewards for the other two things too, as getting the Jarlings will get you access to new items in an NPC known as the Danjon's shop, while the soul stones allow you to choose between increasing your Lacrima gain, the leveling up currency, or the amount of health your healing items restore. That choice is a nice thing, but what the game fails to mention is that it's the healing that's the way to go here, as there's really no other way to improve healing outside of the system. Oh, and before I forget, as the game certainly seems to, there's actually a third way to power yourself up, beyond the soul stones and your standard leveling system. This involves getting the very story-related pickup items like diary pages, memos, etc., and all of these feed into Khazan's memories of that particular mission. This includes the cutscenes and the boss encounters and whatnot, but getting all those memories in a mission allows you to spend said memory points on increasing either your stamina damage, your actual damage, or your damage multiplier on successive hits. Added to that, if you're going for the true ending of the game, then you not only have to make sure you find all these memory-related items, but you also have to complete all of the game's side missions. And frequently, these side missions will feature a powered-up Phase 2 version of a boss you've already fought before. One example that is definitely the most memorable for me is facing off against Guido, who is basically Maluca's second phase, except, with a full health bar this time. So yeah, between all the collectibles together, the enemy challenges, and the side missions, this game can really put on the hurt in terms of exploration as well. Now, after having said all of that, having discussed it, talked about it, and whatnot, with all of that difficulty and toughness in the game, is the First Berserker Khazan worth it? Is pushing through all that tough stuff ultimately rewarding and satisfying? Well, yeah, it kind of is. Look, the game is rewarding, and there is a lot of fun to be had here. The various moves and special powers that the game gives you are a joy to use, and once you master all the different tool sets and use them while learning how to dominate bosses, then there is a sense of surmounting a really tough challenge and accomplishing something impressive. But, and this is a big but, I think that for a lot of people, that sense of accomplishment is also going to be accompanied by a real sense of exhaustion, or at the very least, contentment. Often, after I beat a particularly hard boss and finally moved forward, I was certainly happy with what I had accomplished, but was also really drained and tired as well. There was a feeling of being satiated from the game, of kind of being done for the day. Thus, I found myself frequently putting the game down and taking breaks, and that's not something that I've ever experienced on such a consistent basis throughout my playtime with a Souls game. In other Souls games or Souls-likes, after beating a boss and moving forward, I'd have this kind of rush of excitement to keep playing and see what was next. But with Berserker Khazan, with how much the game demands of you, how much you need to put into it, well, it's best enjoyed in small doses rather than long binge sessions. The difficulty, therefore, is both intentional and kind of a double-edged sword. I think more so than any other Souls-like, this game is going to have a lot of people check out and bail at various points in the game. And, if nothing else, the game's trophy percentages definitely seem to echo that particular idea. So yeah, the First Berserker Khazan is a well-made, exceedingly difficult and punishing game that I think only the most hardcore of players are going to stick with and enjoy till the end. And honestly, I think that's okay, because that is what the developers of the game intended and who they designed the game for. Finally, I do want to know what you thought of the game and its difficulty. Was the game too hard for you? Was it just right? And how long did it take you to beat the game if you did? And if you dropped it, what was the point that you dropped it at? Please feel free to share not only your thoughts in the comments, but also leave a like on the video if you found this analysis useful. And, as we often do on this channel, I'll just say that I'll see you in the comments below where we can discuss all of this further.